The wind had a sharp edge that morning, carrying the first flakes of snow across the high mountain airstrip. Captain Rachel Hayes pulled her jacket tighter as she walked the perimeter of Whitmore Air Base, her weathered boots crunching on the frost-covered tarmac. The cold settled over the base like a silent warning, crisp and unforgiving. At 38, Rachel had learned to read the mountains better than most people read books. She'd grown up in Montana, daughter of a crop duster who taught her that weather didn't negotiate. 20 years in the Air Force had only sharpened that instinct. Now, as the base's logistics coordinator, she spent her days managing supply runs and cargo manifests while younger pilots flew the glory missions. Along the flight line, modern cargo planes stood in precise formation, sleek C-130s and C-17s with their gray bodies gleaming beneath layers of frost. Crews moved with practice speed, checking flaps and gauges, securing cargo that couldn't wait for better weather. The storm was building, and tension rippled through the base with every gust of wind that kicked up loose snow along the concrete. But at the far end of the strip, where the lights barely reached, sat something different. Entirely. The C-47 looked like a relic from another war. Its paint was dulled and chipped, its fuselage streaked with stains from decades of weather. The tires were scuffed, the propellers nicked along the edges. Most of the crew called it the old bird, with the kind of affection reserved for something past its prime. Rachel stood beside it now, her gloved hand resting lightly along the curve of its nose. She wasn't flashy like the hotshot pilots, no perfectly pressed uniform or polished boots. Her flight suit had seen better days, worn at the seams from years of real work. A folded map poked from one of her thigh pockets, creased and softened by constant use. She watched the crew's work on the modern aircraft, eyes calm and steady, then turned her attention back to the C-47. The storm would come. Faster than they thought. She could feel it in the way the wind shifted, taste it in the snow on the air. The weather reports were wrong. She'd seen this pattern before. When Rachel approached the cluster of officers near the command tent, intending to share her concerns, they barely paused. Captain Derek Morrison, the base's golden boy with his polished boots and perfect posture, waved her off before she could finish. "Hayes, your logistics, Mount Meteorology," he said, his voice carrying easily over the wind. The others chuckled, not with malice, but with the casual dismissal reserved for someone they'd already categorized. Leave the weather to the weather service. Rachel inclined her head slightly, not arguing. There was no point. She'd learned long ago that words meant little to men who trusted only noise and shine. Instead, she stepped back, her boots crunching softly in the thin layer of snow that had begun to coat the tarmac. As she turned toward the C-47 once more, she heard another voice, this one dripping with easy mockery. Lieutenant Jason Parks, fresh from flight school, muttered just loud enough for others to hear. That old bird wouldn't survive 10 minutes in this storm. The comment drew knowing smiles, but no one looked her way for a reaction. They didn't expect one from Hayes, the logistics lady, the quiet woman who kept their supply lines running, but never asked for credit. Rachel walked the length of the aircraft, checking tie-downs that no one else would have bothered with, straightening a strap that had come loose in the restless wind. Her fingers, steady in their worn gloves, brushed ice from a window edge. The metal was cold beneath her palm, but it felt solid, honest in a way the newer planes didn't. The C-47 had no polish left, but it had something the others lacked: proven endurance. Built in 1943, it had flown supply runs over the Himalayas, dropped paratroopers on D-Day, and survived storms that would have grounded anything else. Rachel knew its history because she'd made it her business to know. Beyond the airstrip, the storm front crept closer, a low wall of gray that swallowed the horizon inch by inch. The mountains that framed the base were already half lost behind curtains of blowing snow. Inside the command post, officers spoke in clipped tones, voices tight with urgency as they ran through last-minute plans for the supply mission to Forward Operating Base Summit. The outpost sat on a narrow mountain shelf 60 miles north close. Enough for a routine flight, far enough to be deadly if the weather turned. 23 personnel were stationed there, monitoring communications equipment that couldn't be moved. They were counting on this supply run for fuel, medical supplies, and food to last through the winter. No one asked Rachel what she thought about the weather. No one noticed the way she studied the storm's advance or how she glanced toward the ridge where the wind bent the trees nearly double. She was a figure at the edge of their vision, no more important than the ground crew coiling cables or the mechanics wiping down tools they would soon abandon to shelter. Her gaze fell once more on the C-47. She took a slow breath and reached for the flight gloves looped through her belt, tugging them snug over chilled fingers. The old aircraft seemed to lean into the wind, as if it too understood what lay ahead. Rachel stepped back, scanning its lines, checking what could be checked without drawing attention. The propeller blades shivered slightly as the wind rose. Again, but the plane held steady as it always had. Near the flight line, the modern cargo planes began final preparations, engines winding up in a chorus of power and precision. Ground crews shouted over the roar, their breath visible in the cold. The storm pressed closer, the first true flakes of snow now falling thick enough to blur outlines and soften the harsh angles of steel and concrete. Rachel remained still, her posture easy, her face unreadable beneath the brim of her cap. She knew what they didn't yet see, that the storm was no longer a distant threat. It was here. Colonel James Brennan, the base commander, glanced her way at last, irritation playing in the tight line of his mouth. "Hayes, you shouldn't be out here," he called. "Off the flight line, now." His tone left no room for discussion. Rachel nodded once and stepped away as ordered, but as she walked back toward the C-47 shadow, she allowed herself one last look at the sleek planes lined up for takeoff. Their power was unquestioned, their purpose clear. But as the snow thickened and the wind howled across the mountain pass, Rachel wondered if any of them would matter once the storm had its say. The C-47 waited in silence, as steady as the woman beside it. Neither sought recognition. Both were ready. The storm was coming, and with it, a test that would separate the proven from the pretty. The storm arrived with a fury that no one had expected, though the signs had been there for hours. By mid-morning, the sky was a uniform wall of white, and the wind howled through the mountain pass with the voice of something ancient and wild. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, swirling in chaotic eddies that turned the airstrip into a ghostly wasteland. Rachel stood at the window of the operations building, watching visibility drop to nothing in moments. Even the bright landing lights lining the runway seemed to flicker and fade, swallowed by the storm's relentless advance. Her weathered hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "Jesus," muttered Sergeant Mike Torres, the crew chief, as he joined her at the window. "Weather Service said light snow." "Weather Service doesn't live up here," Rachel replied quietly, her breath fogging the glass. She'd tried to warn them. 3 times she'd approached different officers with her concerns about the storm track, the wind shear patterns, the way the barometric pressure was dropping faster than their instruments could track. 3 times she'd been dismissed. "Your logistics. Hayes, stay in your lane." Outside, the modern cargo planes that had stood so proud along the flight line now looked like stranded beasts. Their sleek bodies, designed for speed and power, were coated in ice that spread in jagged patterns along wings and fuselage. Ground crews struggled desperately to keep the engines warm enough to start, their efforts growing more frantic as the storm tightened its grip. The roar of turbines became a faltering groan, the promise of flight choked by snow and wind. Hangar doors banged open and shut in the gale, metal on metal, sharp and jarring against the steady roar of the blizzard. Inside the operations tent, voices crackled over the radio, clipped and tense, nearly lost in static. Forward Operating Base Summit was calling for help. Their fuel stores were critically low. The generators couldn't run without it. Medical supplies were down to nothing, and 3 of their people had already fallen ill from the cold. Summit Base to Whitmore. Do you copy? The voice was Sergeant First Class David Kim, and Rachel could hear the strain beneath his professional calm. We're looking at complete power failure within 8 hours. Repeat, critical supply situation. Rachel moved closer to the radio, but Captain Morrison was already there, microphone in hand. His earlier confidence had evaporated with the storm's arrival. Summit Base, we copy. Stand by for update. He clicked off and turned to Colonel Brennan, who stood near the command table with his face pale beneath the harsh lights. The confidence that had filled the room that morning was gone, eroded by the storm's ferocity. Sir, we can't get anything airborne in this, Morrison said, his voice tight. The C-130s are ice solid. Even if we could start them, the crosswinds are gusting to 60 knots. Brennan nodded grimly. What about waiting for a break? Lieutenant Parks, the young pilot who'd mocked the C-47 earlier, shook his head. Weather's showing solid for the next 18 hours, sir. Maybe longer. Rachel watched the group of officers huddled around weather charts and flight plans, their voices growing more desperate with each passing minute. They spoke in tight, urgent bursts, trying to find solutions where none seemed to exist. Flight plans were revised, scrapped, and revised again. Numbers were recalculated, risk weighed against necessity. But no one mentioned the C-47. No one spoke of alternatives. Rachel slipped out of the operations tent and into the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow, driving snow into her face with stinging force. She pulled her jacket hood up and made her way toward the far end of the flight line, where the old bird waited. The storm was worse than she'd expected, not just in intensity, but in character. This wasn't a standard mountain blizzard. The wind patterns were chaotic, the downdraft severe. It would challenge even the most experienced pilot. But as she approached the C-47, Rachel felt something she hadn't felt all morning. Possibility. The old aircraft sat exactly where she'd left it, snow gathering along its wings, but its frame solid beneath the weight of winter. Unlike the modern planes with their complex systems and delicate electronics, the C-47 was built for punishment. Its radial engines were designed to run in conditions that would shut down a turbine. Its simple, robust systems could function when computerized aircraft failed. Rachel pulled out her weathered map, shielding it from the wind as best she could. She'd flown this route before, not officially, never in conditions like this, but she knew every ridge, every valley, every wind pattern. The path to Summit Base threaded through narrow mountain passes that would be suicide for a large aircraft. But the C-47 was different. It was built for short, rough strips and impossible conditions. Back inside the operations tent, the situation had grown more desperate. The radio crackled again with Summit Base's increasingly urgent calls. Their backup generator was failing. The temperature was dropping. They needed help within hours, not days. We have to try something, Colonel Brennan said, his voice strained. Those people are counting on us. Sir, with respect, there's nothing to try, Morrison replied. We can't get through this storm. No aircraft we have can handle these conditions. Rachel stepped forward from where she'd been standing at the edge of the tent. Colonel, I'd like to make a suggestion. The room fell quiet. Brennan looked at her with barely concealed irritation. Hayes, unless you've got a magic solution to this weather. The C-47, sir. It was built for exactly these conditions. Short strips, rough weather, minimal ground support. I know the route, and I know the aircraft." For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the laughter came not loud or cruel, but filled with disbelief. "Hayes," Morrison said, shaking his head, "that old bird wouldn't make it halfway to the first ridge. And you're not even rated for tactical operations." Lieutenant Parks chimed in with a smirk. "Besides, it's got what, maybe a 50-50 chance of even starting in this cold." "Ma'am, you're talking about flying through mountain passes in near-zero visibility," added Major Patricia Wells, the operations officer. "That's not a supply run, that's a suicide mission." Colonel Brennan held up a hand to quiet the room. "Hayes, I appreciate your ... initiative, but your logistics. You process supply requests and manage inventory. This situation requires combat-rated pilots with tactical experience." "Sir, I've been flying for 20 years. Flying desk-to-base transport runs," Morrison interrupted. "This is different. This is exactly what the C-47 was designed for," Rachel said quietly. "And those people at Summit Base don't care about our ratings or our egos. They care about surviving the night." Brennan's face hardened. "Hayes, you're out of line. The decision is made. We wait for the weather to break. And if it doesn't break in time, that's not your concern." His voice carried the finality of command. "Stand down. That's an order." Rachel nodded once, accepting their verdict with the same quiet dignity she'd shown all morning. But as she left the tent, stepping back into the storm's fury, her mind was already made up. Some decisions weren't made with permission. They were made with purpose. Outside, the storm raged with increasing violence, but at the far end of the flight line, the C-47 waited patient, proven, and ready, just like the woman who'd already decided to fly it. The line between what was allowed and what was necessary had blurred the moment Summit Base called for help, the moment no one else answered. Rachel pulled her gloves tight and headed for the old bird. The storm had shown its hand. Now it was time to show hers. The radio call came at 1400 hours, cutting through the static like a knife. Rachel was in the supply warehouse, ostensibly checking inventory manifests, but really listening to every transmission from the operations tent next door. "Whitmore Base, this is Summit Base. Emergency status." Sergeant Kim's voice was tight, with controlled panic. "We have a medical emergency. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh collapsed. Symptoms consistent with severe hypothermia. She needs immediate evacuation or she's not going to make it through the night." Rachel stopped pretending to work on her clipboard. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sudden commotion in ops chairs, scraping, voices rising, the sharp crack of Colonel Brennan's palm hitting the desk. "God damn it," she heard him mutter. "Torres, what's the status on those engines?" "Still ice solid, sir. We can't even get the cowlings off in this wind." The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it had gotten worse. Rachel had been watching the weather patterns all day, noting the pressure drops, the wind shifts, the way the snow fell in increasingly violent bursts. This wasn't going to break anytime soon. She moved quietly to the door connecting the warehouse. To ops, pressing her ear against the cold metal. Inside, she could hear Colonel Brennan on the radio. "Summit Base, we copy your emergency. Medical evacuation is... We're working on solutions. Stand by." "Sir, with respect, we don't have much." "Time to stand by." Kim's voice crackled back. "Walsh is unconscious. Her core temp is dropping. We need her out of here." Rachel had met Jennifer Walsh during the staff sergeant's last visit to the main base. A tough kid from Ohio, barely 25, with a quick smile and a head for a communications tech. She didn't deserve to die on that mountain because of bureaucratic pride. The door to ops burst open, and Captain Morrison emerged, nearly colliding with Rachel. His face was flushed with frustration and something that looked like fear. "Hayes, what are you doing here? Working, sir. Same as always. She gestured to her clipboard. Inventory. He looked at her suspiciously, then seemed to remember he had bigger problems. Listen, forget the paperwork today. We need all hands on deck trying to get these aircraft operational. Yes, sir. Anything specific I can do? Morrison ran a hand through his hair. I don't know. Pray for a miracle? As he hurried past, Rachel caught sight of the operations tent through the open door. Colonel Brennan was bent over weather charts, his face grim. Major Wells was on another radio, trying to coordinate with search and rescue units that were just as grounded as everyone else. Lieutenant Parks stood near the back, his earlier cockiness replaced by the pale realization that someone might actually die on his watch. Rachel made her decision. She slipped back into the warehouse and gathered what she needed. Emergency medical. Supplies, cold weather gear, high-energy rations. Everything she loaded into a waterproof bag, working quickly but carefully. She'd done this before, not officially, never officially. But during her years managing logistics, she'd made more than one unauthorized supply run to forward positions that were running low on essentials. The difference was, those flights had been in good weather, during peacetime, to bases that were just inconvenienced rather than dying. Through the warehouse's small window, she could see the C-47 through the swirling snow. It sat exactly where it had been all day, patient and solid, while the newer aircraft remained grounded by conditions they weren't built to handle. Rachel had spent her lunch break checking the old bird's maintenance logs. The last inspection had been clean. The engines had been winterized properly. The fuel tanks were full. It was ready to fly, if someone was ready to fly it. The door from ops opened again, and this time it was Sergeant Torres. His face was streaked with grease and frustration. Hayes, you seen any de-icing compound in your inventory? We're trying everything to get these engines free. Check this morning, Sergeant. We're almost out. Been requisitioning more for weeks. But you know how procurement works. Torres cursed it under his breath. This is insane. We've got 23 people up there, one of them dying, and we can't get a single aircraft off the ground. What about civilian contractors? Private aircraft? In this weather? You kidding me? Nothing's flying within 300 miles of here. He left, slamming the door behind him. Rachel listened to his footsteps fade, then moved to her desk and pulled out a piece of paper. She wrote quickly, Colonel Brennan, by the time you read this, I'll be airborne in the C-47. Staff Sergeant Walsh needs immediate medical evacuation, and we both know the weather isn't breaking anytime soon. The old bird was built for exactly these conditions, and I know the route. I take full responsibility for this decision and any consequences. Court-martial me when I get back if you want, but those people need help now. The C-47 is fueled and ready. Estimated flight time to Summit Base is 90 minutes each way in current conditions. Captain Rachel Hayes. She folded the letter and left it on her desk where it would be found, then shouldered her supply bag and headed for the door. The storm hit her like a wall as she stepped outside, but she pushed through it, following the flight line toward the far end where the C-47 waited. Behind her, the operations tent glowed yellow in the storm, filled with the voices of people trying to solve an impossible problem with inadequate tools. Ahead, the old bird sat in the gathering darkness, snow piling against its landing gear, but its profile still proud and ready. Rachel had made her choice. In 30 minutes, she'd either be airborne or dead. But Staff Sergeant Walsh would have her chance, and that was worth whatever happened next. The breaking point wasn't when they told her she couldn't fly. It was when a young woman started dying while perfectly good aircraft sat grounded by fear and regulation. Some lines weren't meant to be crossed. Others existed only to be ignored when lives were at stake. Rachel Hayes had found hers. The C-47's cockpit was tomb cold when Rachel climbed in, her breath immediately fogging in the enclosed space. Ice had formed on the inside of the windows overnight, and the instrument panel felt brittle beneath her gloved hands. But she'd started aircraft in worse conditions, back in Montana, helping her father with the crop duster on mornings when the thermometer didn't climb above zero. She worked methodically, the way he taught her. Check the control surfaces stiff but functional. Test the rudder pedals, they responded with effort. Prime the fuel system, set the mixture, crack the throttles just enough. The ritual was as familiar as breathing, muscle memory built over 2 decades of flying. The engines were the real test. Radial engines in freezing weather could be temperamental, but they were also nearly indestructible once running. Rachel had learned their moves during her early years in the service, flying supplies to remote bases where reliability mattered more than speed. She hit the starter for the port engine. It groaned, protested, then caught with a cough that sent a shudder through the entire airframe. Blue smoke poured from the exhaust as the cylinders wound, and the propeller began its slow, deliberate rotation. The starboard engine took more coaxing. It cranked twice without catching, and for a moment, Rachel wondered if she'd miscalculated. Then, with a roar that seemed to announce its displeasure at being awakened, it came to life. The C-47 settled into its familiar rhythm, not the smooth whine of modern turbines, but the deep, purposeful rumble of machinery built to work. Through the storm, she could see lights flickering in the operations tent. They'd be discovering her letter soon, if they hadn't already. She imagined Colonel Brennan's face when he realized what she'd done. Captain Morrison's outrage, Lieutenant Parks's disbelief. Let them be angry. Staff Sergeant Walsh didn't have time for their bureaucracy. Rachel ran through her pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. Fuel pumps on, mixture rich, props in fine pitch. The radio crackled with routine base communications, but she left it off. There would be time for explanations later, if there was a later. The medical supplies were secured in the cargo bay, along with emergency fuel and rations for the summit. Base team. Everything they'd need to keep going until the storm passed and regular supply flights could resume. She checked her charts one final time, though she hardly needed them. The route to Summit Base was burned into her memory. Northwest through Devil's Gap, following the valley floor for 30 miles. Then a climbing turn through Widow's Pass to the plateau where the Ford base sat. In good weather, it was a routine 40-minute flight. In conditions like this, it would be the most challenging thing she'd ever attempted. The C-47 shuddered as a gust of wind caught it, but the old bird held steady. Rachel advanced the throttle slightly, feeling the engines respond with increased power. Ice began to shed from the wings as heat from the engines warmed the airframe. She was committed now. There was no backing down, no changing her mind. Either she'd succeed in getting through to Summit Base, or they'd find her wreckage in the spring when the snow melted. Through the swirling snow, she caught sight of figures running toward the aircraft. Even at this distance, she could see Colonel Brennan's characteristic stride, Morrison's frantic gesturing. They'd found her letter. Rachel released the brakes and began her taxi toward the runway. The C-47 moved slowly through the accumulated snow, its tail wheel leaving a clear track. Behind, the radio suddenly burst to life. Hayes, Captain Hayes, return to the hangar immediately. That's a direct order. She reached over and switched the radio off. Some conversations were better had after the mission was complete. The runway stretched. Ahead, its edges barely visible through the storm. The wind was gusting from the northwest. Not ideal, but manageable. She'd taken off in worse conditions, though admittedly not in weather quite this violent. Rachel lined up the aircraft and pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared in response, and the C-47 began its roll down the icy runway. The takeoff Runs seemed to last forever, the old bird accelerating reluctantly in the thin mountain air, fighting both the storm and the accumulated ice on its surfaces. At the point where a modern aircraft would have been airborne, the C-47 was still earthbound, still gathering speed. But Rachel waited, patient, feeling for the moment when the wings would finally overcome gravity. It came suddenly, a lightness in the controls, a sense of the aircraft wanting to fly rather than being forced to. She eased back on the yoke, and the C-47 lifted clear of the runway, climbing into the storm with the determination of something that had been built for exactly this purpose. Below, Whitmore Air Base disappeared into the white chaos, its lights swallowed by the storm. Ahead lay 60 miles of the most treacherous mountain flying in North America, in conditions that had already grounded every other aircraft on the base. But Rachel Hayes was no longer the quiet logistics officer who processed supply requests and kept inventory. She was a pilot with 20 years of experience, flying an aircraft that had proven itself in wars and storms around the world. The C-47 climbed steadily into the maelstrom, its engines maintaining their reassuring rumble despite the battering wind. Ice began to form on the leading edges of the wings, but not fast enough to overwhelm the old bird's capabilities. Rachel settled into the rhythm of storm flying constant adjustments to heading and altitude, reading the wind through the seat of her pants, trusting her instruments when visibility dropped to zero. The modern pilots back at base relied on GPS and weather radar and computer-assisted navigation. She had a compass, an altimeter, and 30 years of mountain flying experience. It would have to be enough. 15 minutes after takeoff, she was threading the needle through Devil's Gap, the canyon walls invisible on either side but close enough to feel their presence. The C-47 bucked and rolled in the turbulence, but it held its heading with the stubborn reliability that had made it legendary. Staff Sergeant Walsh was still alive. The storm was still raging, and the old bird was proving, once again, that sometimes the best technology was the one that never stopped working. Rachel Hayes smiled for the first time all day. They'd called her crazy, reckless, insubordinate. They were probably right. But in 45 minutes, she'd be landing at Summit Base with the supplies and medical evacuation capability that could save a life. The rest was just paperwork. The turbulence hit the C-47 like a giant's fist 20 minutes into the flight, dropping it 300 feet in seconds before Rachel could wrestle it back to level flight. Her stomach lurched, but her hands remained steady on the controls. The old bird groaned and flexed around her, but it held together just as it had been designed to do. She was deep in Devil's Gap now, the canyon walls invisible in the storm, but close enough that she could feel their presence pressing in from both sides. The altimeter needle danced wildly as downdrafts and updrafts battled for control of the aircraft. Ice was building on the wings faster than she'd hoped, but not fast enough to force her down. Not yet. The radio crackled to life despite being switched off emergency override from base. Colonel Brennan's voice cut through the static, tight with barely controlled fury. Hayes, respond immediately. You are in violation of direct orders and endangering base aircraft. Return to base now or face court-martial proceedings. Rachel glanced at the radio, then deliberately reached over and pulled the circuit breaker. She had more important things to worry about than Brennan's wounded ego. The wind shear through Devil's Gap was legendary among pilots' currents that could flip an aircraft upside down in seconds. Downdrafts that slammed planes into canyon walls before pilots knew what hit them. But the C-47 had been through worse. This same aircraft tail, number 4315977, had flown the hump during World War II, carrying supplies over the Himalayas in conditions that made today's storm look like a spring shower. Rachel knew because she'd researched it during her quiet years managing logistics, tracing the old bird's history through maintenance logs and war records. It had flown 847 combat missions, survived 2 engine failures, and once landed safely after taking flak that has punched holes through both wings. If it could handle Japanese fighters and Himalayan thunderstorms, it could handle one Montana blizzard. The first sign of trouble came 30 minutes in. As she began the climbing turn toward Widow's Pass, the port engine began running rough, its rhythm interrupted by occasional misses that sent vibrations through the airframe. Ice in the carburetor, exactly what she'd been afraid of. Rachel pulled on carburetor heat and adjusted the mixture, coaxing the engine back to smooth operation. But she was burning fuel faster than planned, fighting headwinds that were stronger than the weather service had predicted. The margin for error was shrinking with every mile. Behind her, in the operations tent at Whitmore Base, she imagined the chaos her flight had caused. Morrison would be demanding her immediate recall. Major Wells would be calculating liability and risk assessments. Lieutenant Parks would probably be taking bets on whether she'd make it through the first mountain pass. But Colonel Brennan would be doing something else entirely. Despite his bluster and his wounded authority, he was a good officer who understood what was at stake. He'd be monitoring her progress, calculating her fuel burn, preparing search and rescue assets for when not if she went down, because that's what good commanders did, even when their subordinates went rogue. The thought almost made her smile. She'd spent 15 years watching younger, flashier pilots get the challenging assignments while she processed supply requests and managed inventory. They'd seen her as the quiet background figure who kept the bureaucracy running, useful but unremarkable. They'd never bothered to check her flight records from her early years in the service. Never noticed that she'd logged more mountain flying time than half the tactical pilots on base. Never asked why a pilot with her qualifications had ended up in logistics instead of operations. The answer was simple. She'd requested it. After her husband died in a training accident 8 years ago, she'd wanted something stable, predictable, safe. Logistics meant regular hours, minimal risk, and no chance of leaving her daughter Emma orphaned at age 10. But Emma was 18 now, off at college, making her own way in the world. And Staff Sergeant Walsh was dying on a mountain because no one else was willing to risk their careers on an impossible flight. Sometimes impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet by someone stubborn enough to try. The C-47 bucked again as it hit another wall of turbulence, but Rachel was ready for it this time. She rode the downdraft like a surfer riding a wave, using the aircraft's weight and momentum to punch through to smoother air on the other side. The old bird responded like it understood what they were trying to accomplish together. 45 minutes out, she caught her first glimpse of Summit Base's beacon through the storm, a faint red pulse barely visible through the swirling snow. The forward operating base sat on a narrow plateau carved into the mountainside, surrounded by peaks that rose another 1,000 feet on all sides. In good weather, it was a challenging approach. In conditions like this, it was borderline suicidal. But she'd made more difficult landings during her early years in Bush, Alaska, flying supplies to remote villages in aircraft that were older and less reliable than the C-47. The key was patience, precision, and absolute trust in your aircraft. As she began her descent toward the plateau, Rachel keyed the radio one final time, switching to Summit Base's frequency. Summit Base, this is Logistics 17, inbound with medical evacuation and emergency supplies. Request runway status and wind information. The response came immediately, Sergeant Kim's voice sharp with disbelief and relief. Logistics 17, Summit Base. Confirm you are airborne and inbound. Over. Confirmed. Summit Base. ETA 10 minutes. How's your patient? Still with us, but barely. Runway is ... well. It's mostly clear. Wind is gusting to 40 knots from the northwest. We've got flares set up for approach lighting. Rachel smiled grimly. Mostly clear meant packed with snow and ice. 40-knot crosswinds meant the landing would be more like a controlled crash than a normal approach. And flares for lighting meant she'd be landing by firelight in near-zero visibility. She'd had easier days at the office. But as the C-47 descended through the storm toward Summit Base, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The pure, uncomplicated satisfaction of doing exactly what she was meant to do. Not managing supply requests or processing paperwork, but really flying in conditions that separated the professionals from the pretenders. The old bird seemed to sense it too. Despite the ice, despite the turbulence, despite the engine, that was still running rough. It flew with the confident steadiness of an aircraft that had been built for moments exactly like this. In the distance, she could see the flares marking the runway's edges, flickering points of light in the storms. Fury. Staff Sergeant Walsh was counting on her now. The entire Summit Base team was counting on her. And for the first time in 8 years, Captain Rachel Hayes was exactly where she belonged. The approach to Summit Base looked like something from a pilot's worst nightmare. The plateau was barely visible through the storm, its edges defined only by the flickering red flares that the ground crew had managed to place despite the howling wind. Beyond those markers lay a 1,000-foot drop into the valley below. Rachel held the C-47 steady as she lined up for final approach, fighting crosswinds that tried to push her sideways into the mountain face. The runway, if it could still be called that, was a narrow strip of packed snow between towering rock walls, barely long enough for the old bird under perfect conditions. These were far from perfect conditions. Summit Base, Logistics 17. On final approach, confirm all personnel clear of runway. All clear, 17. Wind now gusting to 45 knots. You sure about this? Rachel didn't answer. She was too busy wrestling the aircraft through air that seemed determined to slam her into the mountainside. The C-47 dropped suddenly as a downdraft caught it, falling like a stone for 3 terrifying seconds before she regained control. Her altitude was now critically low. One more drop like that, and she'd be meeting the mountain face first. The flares rushed past her wingtips, marking the beginning of the runway. Rachel cut power and pulled back on the yoke, feeling for that perfect moment when the aircraft would settle onto the snow-covered strip. The main gear touched down hard, bounced once, then found purchase on the icy surface. But they weren't down yet. The C-47 skidded sideways as a gust caught the tail, the aircraft sliding toward the edge of the plateau, where the lights disappeared into darkness. Rachel stood on the brakes, feeling the wheels lock and unlock as they fought for grip on the ice. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed like they might slide right off the mountain. Then the tail wheel found traction, and the old bird straightened out, rolling to a stop just 50 feet from the plateau's edge. Rachel sat in the cockpit for a moment, her hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline caught up with her. She'd just completed one of the most challenging landings of her career in an aircraft that half the base thought was barely airworthy. Outside, figures were already running toward the plane, bundled shapes moving through the storm with urgent purpose. She shut down the engines and grabbed her medical kit, stepping out into the wind that nearly knocked her off her feet. "Captain Hayes?" Sergeant Kim appeared at her elbow, his face streaked with ice but his eyes bright with relief. "I can't believe you made it through that storm. Where's Walsh?" "Medical tent, ma'am. Doc Peterson's been working on her, but her core temp is still dropping. We need to get her out of here fast." Rachel followed him through the storm to a small tent glowing with the yellow light of battery-powered heaters. Inside, Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh lay unconscious on a stretcher, her face pale and her breathing shallow. A young medic, probably. not much older than Rachel's daughter, was monitoring her vital signs with grim concentration. "How long does she have?" Rachel asked, "Without proper medical facilities." "Maybe 2 hours, ma'am. We've done everything we can here." Rachel nodded and turned to Kim. "Get your people ready to load supplies. Food, fuel, medical equipment, everything's in the cargo bay. And I'll need 4 volunteers to help carry Walsh to the aircraft." "Ma'am, you're not thinking of flying back in this, are you?" Rachel looked at him with the expression she'd perfected over 2 decades of military service. The one that said the question had already been answered. "Sergeant, that woman is going to die if she doesn't get to a real hospital. The storm isn't going to break anytime soon." "So yes, I'm flying back." Kim nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. We'll have her ready in 5 minutes." The loading process was a nightmare of wind, snow, and frantic activity. The supplies came off the C-47 quickly: emergency rations, medical supplies, diesel fuel for the generators. Everything Summit Base needed to survive until regular supply flights could resume. Getting Walsh aboard was more challenging. She was unconscious and hypothermic, requiring careful handling to avoid further injury. Rachel supervised personally, drawing on her years of emergency medical training to ensure the stretcher was properly secured in the cargo bay. As they worked, more radio chatter crackled from the base communications tent. Summit Base's radio operator was relaying messages between Rachel and Whitmore Base, whether she wanted them or not. "Logistics 17. This is Colonel Brennan. You will return immediately and report for disciplinary action. Your unauthorized flight has endangered base assets and violated multiple regulations." Rachel keyed her radio calmly. "Colonel, I copy your message. Patient is loaded, and we're preparing for departure. Estimate arrival Whitmore Base in 90 minutes. Hayes, that's not a request. That's a direct order." "You will." She switched the radio off. Some conversations could wait until after she'd saved a life. The return flight would be even more challenging than the approach. She'd burn more fuel than planned fighting the headwinds, and the C-47 would be flying heavy with Walsh and her. Medical equipment aboard. The margin for error was now essentially zero. But as Rachel ran through her pre-flight checks one final time, she felt the same calm confidence that had carried her through the approach. The old bird had gotten her. This far, it would get her home. Sergeant Kim appeared at the cockpit door as she prepared to start engines. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, what you did today, flying through that storm... We won't forget it." Rachel nodded. "Just take care of your people, Sergeant. That's what we're all here for." She hit the starters, and the radial engines coughed to life once more. Their familiar rumble, a reassuring sound in the storm's chaos. The C-47 was ready for the journey home. Behind her in the cargo bay, Staff Sergeant Walsh fought for her life. Ahead lay 60 miles of the worst flying weather Rachel had ever encountered. And waiting at Whitmore Base was a career-ending confrontation, with officers who would never understand that some rules existed to be broken when lives were at stake. But for the moment, none of that mattered. She had a patient to deliver and a promise to keep. The rest would sort itself out. Rachel advanced the throttles and began her taxi toward the makeshift runway. The storm was still raging, the crosswinds still trying to kill her, and the visibility still near zero. It was going to be a hell of a flight home. The return flight to Whitmore Base was 75 minutes of pure hell. The storm had intensified while Rachel was on the ground at Summit Base, and the C-47 fought for every mile against headwinds that sometimes exceeded 60 knots. Ice built up on the wings faster than the old bird's heating system could shed it, forcing her to constantly adjust power and attitude to maintain level flight. But Staff Sergeant Walsh was alive. That was what mattered. Rachel had checked on her patient twice during the flight, leaving the autopilot engaged long enough to ensure Walsh's condition hadn't deteriorated. The young woman was still unconscious, still fighting hypothermia, but her breathing had stabilized and her color was slightly better. She might actually make it if Rachel could get her to the base hospital in time. The approach to Whitmore base was a knife-edge exercise in precision flying. The storm had deposited 3 more inches of snow on the runway, and the crosswinds were gusting strong enough to flip a lighter aircraft. But the C-47 came in heavy and stable, touching down with a thump that Rachel felt through her entire body. As she taxied toward the ramp, she could see the reception committee waiting for her, an ambulance for Walsh, ground crew to secure the aircraft, and a line of officers led by Colonel Brennan. Even through the storm, she could read the tension in their postures. Rachel shut down the engines and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet of the cockpit. She'd completed one of the most challenging flights of her career, delivered critical supplies to an isolated outpost, and potentially saved a young woman's life. In a few minutes, she'd probably be under arrest. It was worth it. The medical team reached the aircraft first, efficiently transferring Walsh to the ambulance under the supervision of the base flight surgeon. Rachel watched through the cargo door as they worked, professional and focused, despite the storm still raging around them. "She's stable," the flight surgeon called over the wind. "Good work getting her out of there, Captain. Another few hours and we'd have lost her." Rachel nodded, but her attention was already shifting to the group of officers approaching the aircraft. Colonel Brennan led the pack, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Captain Morrison flanked him on one side, Major Wells on the other. Even Lieutenant Parks was there, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Captain Hayes," Brennan's voice cut through the storm like a blade. "You are under arrest for disobeying direct orders, unauthorized use of military aircraft, and reckless endangerment of personnel and equipment." Rachel climbed down from the cockpit and stood at attention. "Yes, sir. You have anything to say for yourself?" "The supplies were delivered to Summit Base as requested, sir. Staff Sergeant Walsh has been evacuated for medical treatment. The 147 sustained no damage during the mission." Brennan's face darkened. "That's not what I asked, Captain. I asked if you had anything to say about your complete disregard for military discipline and chain of command." Rachel met his gaze steadily. "No, sir. No? You don't think violating direct orders and stealing a military aircraft requires some explanation?" "I didn't steal anything, sir. I flew a mission to save lives using an aircraft that was certified airworthy and available for operations. The fact that other aircraft were grounded by weather conditions doesn't make the C-47 unavailable." Captain Morrison stepped forward, his voice tight with indignation. "Hayes, you had no authorization for that flight. You're not even rated for tactical operations. You could have been killed, and you could have lost that aircraft. But I wasn't, and I didn't." Rachel's voice remained calm, professional. The mission was completed successfully. "That's not the point." Morrison's composure was cracking. "The point is that you deliberately disobeyed orders and went against established procedure. What you did was reckless and irresponsible." "What I did was necessary." For the first time, Rachel's voice carried an edge. "Staff Sergeant Walsh was dying while we stood around arguing about regulations and procedure. Someone needed to act. That someone should have been properly authorized personnel following proper protocols," Major Wells interjected. "We have procedures for a reason, Captain." Rachel almost laughed. "Major, your procedures left 23 people stranded on a mountain with a medical emergency while perfectly functional aircraft sat grounded because they weren't shiny enough for the storm. The newer aircraft were grounded for legitimate safety reasons," Brennan said. "Those are million-dollar assets, and Staff Sergeant Walsh is a human being." Rachel's composure finally cracked, her voice rising above the storm. "She's 25. Years old, sir. She has her whole life ahead of her. But you were willing to let her die rather than risk some paperwork explaining why the old airplane succeeded, where your modern fleet failed. The group fell silent for a moment, the only sound. The howling wind and the distant whine of the ambulance carrying Walsh to the hospital. Colonel Brennan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Captain Hayes, you are out of line. Your emotional attachment to this situation doesn't excuse your actions. Military discipline exists for a reason, and officers who think they can ignore it when it suits them are a danger to everyone under their command. Sir, with respect, I've served this country for 20 years. I've never received a negative evaluation, never failed to complete a mission, never put personal interests ahead of military objectives. Today, I saved lives using skills and equipment that everyone else had written off. If that makes me a danger to the military, then maybe the military has bigger problems than my insubordination. The silence stretched out, tense and electric. Around them, ground crews continued their work, but Rachel could feel their attention focused on the confrontation playing out in the storm. Finally, Brennan spoke. Captain Hayes, you are confined to quarters pending a formal investigation and court-martial proceedings. You will surrender your flight status and all access codes immediately. Yes, sir. And Hayes? Brennan's voice carried a note Rachel couldn't quite identify. That was some hell of a piece of flying. She looked up, surprised. The colonel's expression hadn't changed, but there was something different in his eyes. A hint of the respect she'd been fighting for her entire career. Thank you, sir. As the officers dispersed and the ground crew began securing the C-47, Rachel stood alone in the storm for a moment, looking at the old bird that had carried her through the impossible. Ice still clung to its wings, and snow was already beginning to accumulate on its fuselage, but it sat steady and proud on the ramp. Tomorrow there would be investigations, hearings, probably a court-martial that would end her career. But tonight, Staff Sergeant Walsh was alive in the base hospital. Summit Base had the supplies they needed to survive the storm, and everyone on Whitmore Base knew that the quiet logistics officer had balls of steel when it counted. Rachel Hayes walked toward the barracks with her head high, leaving footprints in the snow that the storm would erase by morning. But what she'd accomplished today, that would be remembered long after the snow melted and the paperwork was forgotten. The old bird had flown true, and so had she. 3 weeks later, Rachel sat in the base conference room facing a panel of officers she'd never met. The formal investigation had been thorough interviews with everyone involved, technical analysis of the flight, review of weather data, and aircraft maintenance records. The paperwork alone could have choked a horse, but Staff Sergeant Walsh was alive. She'd made a full recovery and was already back on duty, sending Rachel a handwritten thank you note that meant more than any medal ever could. Colonel Brennan sat at the head of the panel, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the final report. To his left was Brigadier General Patricia Hawkins, the wing commander who'd flown in specifically for these proceedings. To his right sat Colonel Michael Torres, a decorated combat pilot whose opinion carried significant weight. Captain Hayes, General Hawkins began, this investigation has presented us with an unusual situation. Your actions on February 15th clearly violated direct orders and established protocols. Under normal circumstances, that would result in court-martial and likely dismissal from service. Rachel sat at attention, her expression calm. She'd made peace with whatever consequences were coming. However, the general continued, the circumstances were far from normal. Your flight saved the life of Staff Sergeant Walsh and delivered critical supplies to personnel who would otherwise have faced life-threatening shortages. Colonel Torres leaned forward. Captain, I've reviewed your complete flight records. Your early years show extensive experience in challenging conditions, bush flying in Alaska, Supply runs to remote locations, mountain operations in Afghanistan. Why didn't this experience show up in your recent evaluations? Rachel chose her words carefully. Sir, my assignment to logistics was by request. After my husband's death 8 years ago, I wanted stability for my daughter's sake. Logistics provided that stability. But you maintained your flight status. Yes, sir. I continued flying transport missions and maintained currency in several aircraft types, including the C-47. General Hawkins consulted her notes. The technical review of your flight shows exceptional airmanship under extreme conditions. The route you chose, your fuel management, your approach, and landing at Summit Base all demonstrate skills considerably beyond what we'd expect from a logistics officer. The C-47 is a proven aircraft, ma'am. It was designed for exactly those conditions. The aircraft was only as good as the pilot flying it, Colonel Brennan interjected. And the pilot in this case displayed judgment and skill that probably saved multiple lives. Rachel blinked, surprised. This wasn't going the direction she'd expected. Colonel Torres spoke again. Captain, we've also reviewed the performance of other personnel during this incident. The dismissive attitude toward your weather warnings, the failure to consider alternative aircraft options, the reluctance to authorize any rescue attempt, all of this has been noted. Sir, I don't want to see anyone else punished for. That's not your concern, Captain, General Hawkins interrupted. Our concern is what to do with an officer who clearly has capabilities that aren't being properly utilized. The general stood and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where the C-47 sat in its usual spot at the far end of the ramp. The old bird had been fully inspected after the flight and declared in excellent condition testament to both its rugged construction and Rachel's careful handling. Captain Hayes, this panel finds that while your actions violated protocol, they were justified by the extraordinary circumstances and the successful outcome. No formal charges will be filed. Rachel felt a wave of relief, but kept her expression neutral. Furthermore, the general continued, effective immediately, you're being reassigned to flight operations as Deputy Operations Officer. Captain Morrison is being transferred to logistics. Apparently, he has a talent for supply chain management that we've been overlooking. Rachel's composure finally cracked. Ma'am, I thank you. Don't thank me yet. Your new position comes with increased responsibility and the expectation that you'll use your obvious flying skills for the benefit of this wing. You'll be directly involved in planning and executing missions in challenging conditions. Colonel, Brennan smiled for the first time Rachel could remember. Seems the Air Force has been wasting one of its better pilots on paperwork for the past 8 years. Time to fix that. As the panel dismissed and the officers filed out, Colonel Torres approached Rachel. Captain, I flew C-47s in Vietnam. That bird out there has probably seen more combat than half the pilots on this base. It's good to see someone who understands what it's capable of. Thank you, sir. It's a remarkable aircraft. So are you. Apparently. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise again. That evening, Rachel stood beside the C-47 as the sun set behind the mountains. The old bird looked exactly as it had 3 weeks ago, weathered, unglamorous, overlooked by most who passed it. But she knew better now, and more importantly, so did everyone else on the base. Sergeant Torres approached, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing a grin. Heard about your promotion, Captain. About damn time, if you ask me. Thanks, Sergeant. How's the maintenance crew treating the old bird? Like a conquering hero. Half the mechanics want to work on her, now turns out everyone loves a winner. He paused, then added more seriously, what you did that day. It mattered, not just for Walsh, but for all of us. Showed us what real leadership looks like. Rachel nodded, running her hand along the C-47's nose. The metal was cold but solid, honest in a way that never went out of style. "Sir?" Torres hesitated. "Mind if I ask what made you decide to take that flight?" "Had to know it could end your career." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the mountains. "Sometimes you have to choose between what's safe and what's right. I'd rather live with the consequences of doing something than spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd tried. And if it hadn't worked out, then at least I'd have tried." She smiled. "Besides, I had a good airplane. And 20 years of experience. The odds weren't as bad as everyone thought." As they walked back toward the operations building, Rachel reflected on the past 3 weeks. The investigation, the panel, the unexpected promotion, all of it had been a whirlwind. But the most important outcome was simple. The next time weather grounded the modern fleet and people needed help, there would be no hesitation, no bureaucratic delays. There would be solutions, not excuses. The old bird sat quietly on the ramp, ready for whatever mission came next. Just like the pilot who'd finally found her place in the Air Force after 20 years of being overlooked. Sometimes the best things came from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the quiet ones had the most to say. And sometimes an old airplane. And a determined pilot could remind everyone what was possible when you stopped making excuses and started making things happen. Rachel Hayes had found her voice. The Air Force had found a leader. And the C-47 had found its place in history one more time. The old bird had flown true, and so had she. Now they were both exactly where they belonged. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from those who shout the loudest, but from those who act when no one else will. Captain Rachel Hayes proved that courage isn't about fearless action. It's about doing what's right despite the fear, despite the consequences, despite the voices that say it can't be done. In a world that often values flash over substance and noise over competence, remember that real leadership sometimes wears a humble face and flies an old airplane through impossible weather to save lives. The next time someone tells you something can't be done, ask yourself, have they actually tried? Or are they just afraid to find out what's possible? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.